All right, we are live.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Today, we will be doing another rendition of Office Hours with Waypoint. This theme will be Microsoft Ignite and a deep dive. Today, we have myself. I'm Taylor Dolezal, obviously. We have Jacquie Grindrod, and we have Evan Phoenix joining us from the Waypoint team today. Any opening words, either of you? And excited that it's Monday. Is it especially Monday for you as well?
Happy Monday, everybody.
It is especially a Monday today. It's very Monday. Just the regular, hey everyone, and thanks for joining us again today. And we're really excited to kind of sit here and talk through some stuff about Waypoint and have your questions come in. As normal, I'll be watching the chat and making sure that any questions that come in are getting asked, and we'll be answering those. And yeah, that's all I've got to say.
I can always tell it's Monday when I find myself especially tongue-tied. So very, very happy that y'all made it out here.
We need to do warm-ups.
Me mamo.
Sally sells seashells down by the seashore.
If there's one thing that we've learned in Hollywood, I think it's that we could just fix that in post. Is I think how that goes.
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think I'd love to just get right into it and start asking you some questions, Evan. So when it comes to, I was checking some of our discuss questions today,
Absolutely.
And one of them that I saw was that really just around what are some of the new things that are coming out in Waypoint 02 or have come out recently that you're excited about, and then we'll kind of move on to 03 and just future plans on that front.
Yeah, I mean, with 02, we did a lot of work. So 02 has been out for I guess a month or two, and I had to go back and we've moved. I mentally moved on, so I know that a lot of stuff that's going on right now is a lot of bug fix. So we're doing some 02 point releases, so various bug fixes. I know that we've been doing a lot of work on getting ECS. Amazon ECS is a big target for folks. We've been seeing a lot of usage there. So we've been putting a bunch of work on various fixes as well as new features, just routing stuff that wasn't available before so you can set those things. We did a bunch of work on server management for 02, as I recall. Some stuff related to hey, I want to do server upgrades and reinstalls, and just more life cycles around how do I make use of this Waypoint server? How do I upgrade it, maintenance, all that kind of stuff. So sort of some care and feeding stuff around that. Stretching now. What else did we do in 02? I know there's been a lot of work as of late on, again, more stuff like a kind of a good example would be sort of more of a completeness thing. An example was originally we only exposed the ability to have one port. If you're doing Kubernetes, you could only say hey, I want to expose this thing on this singular port. We now, Kubernetes services let you do arbitrary ports, so we finally gotten to the point where you can set those. So it's those sorts of more minor things that we're kind of been getting into as of late, the last month or so on the 0.2 front. So
cool. I think one thing I really liked in 02 was dynamic configuration, and then being able to use config maps and things on that nature. I'm still working on some working with Vault and getting that set up in Kubernetes, and then implementing that and kind of getting everything to talk to one another. But really just that ability to use config maps and tie that in, as well as have that automatic reload, is really cool to have. I think I haven't seen too much in the community of people using that in feedback just yet, but personally I've had a lot of fun using that feature.
Yeah, of course. I knew I was forgetting something. Yeah. And then, that is, it's sort of one of those interesting features. We have the entry point binary that sort of unlocks this functionality that is a little bit unique to Waypoint. Obviously, we've got the ability, the entry point binary can read stuff out of config maps, just like you could if you were sort of natively on Kubernetes, but you can kind of get that same functionality no matter if you're not on, if on ECS, if you're wherever you are, and then also with, as you were alluding to, those other sorts of sources that aren't sort of specific to the platform, right? So I would want to read stuff in from Vault, and I know that we support AWS SSM, and I'm sure we've got a bunch of work related to like all the kinds of different targets, and eventually that's also going to be its own plugin sort of framework, so that you've got the ability to say like, actually, I want to support this other thing, and how am I going to build it in? It's a little more complicated because you have to run plugins in the context of the instance that's running. So we haven't fleshed that out yet, so that's why it doesn't exist as of yet. But yeah, a lot of cool stuff there.
I think that it just working with the entry point, like I've been using build pack examples recently, and for those of you that haven't gotten to use Waypoint yet, you can kind of start. It's really a choose your own adventure, right? That's mostly all of infrastructure, which makes it a lot of fun to work in. And you can turn back the page if you've accidentally passed away or something like that. It's really great. What I've really liked about it is just kind of like the ability to use build packs, so cloud native build packs, where you don't have to define a Docker file, and then it will go through and take a look to see if is this a Ruby project, Go, JavaScript, just what have you, or you can specify that Docker file. When it came to implementing and kind of thinking on that entry point, were there any interesting architectural concerns or talks as you were kind of like thinking through that and deciding on having an entry point file to connect with the Waypoint server?
Yeah, so it kind of became this question, architectural question of, we kind of built it up to do different things, but where it actually started was this question of what do we consider table stakes? So what is the minimum amount of functionality that we want to allow Waypoint to have independent of whatever platform you're on? So obviously you can deploy, right? You can make a thing run, right? That's sort of, you can do that on all of them, right? But as we kind of started to get along and started to look at, well, what do we think is important? What do we want to make sure that we can support no matter what? So what platform someone chooses, though, when we got to the logs functionality and the exec functionality, as we got to that much higher level, we got really to this point architecturally where we had to make some very specific decisions about, okay, well, are those required? Are those important enough that we feel like everything should support those independent of where they might be? And if so, how do you support them? So if you were to give me an example, some of the early prototypes supported them like for Kubernetes, but it would just use the existing Kubernetes, kubectl exec, kubectl logs functionality just to get that stuff, which was fine. But then if you switched over to say ECS or somewhere like that, you're like, oh, well, there's no logs command. Okay, well, how do I do that? Okay, well, there's this other thing, and there's no this, that, and so what we ended up deciding was, well, we really want to allow a different, so specifically for logs, there's kind of this two schools of thought about what your logs mean. There's the long-term idea, which is that, hey, I want to be logging all information, and maybe it's specific metrics, maybe it's just specific thing, errors and all that kind of stuff. And then I want to analyze that, and I want to ingest that and have that be available somewhere. So it's like, I want to suck that all into Splunk, and then I want to have a report that says, how many error outputs did I have in a day, that kind of thing. And I want to make that number go down. So you're looking at the log sort of in aggregate. And there's tons of solutions for that. Waypoint doesn't really help you with that right now. But what we did want to look at was this other, more specific case, which is developer log usage. And developer log usage is highly optimized for what just happened. Did the thing happen? What happened? I clicked the button, did the thing happen? Did I click that button, did that thing happen? And so it's, your time horizon is like minutes of what you really want the log. And as soon as that time horizon, maybe a maximum of 30 minutes. Once it goes by, I don't really care. The logs are there, they're sort of not useful anymore. And so we made this decision that we really think that functionality, being able to know like what's going on right now with my app, was of such high importance that we wanted to have Waypoint logs work no matter where you were. And so from an architectural perspective, we made the decision of saying, let's build that functionality, that logs functionality, by having the entry point binary, and therefore that entry point binary could connect back to the server. It could basically feed those logs back, and then you could ask the server, hey, what's going on with my instances right now, which are the individual connections. And so that was sort of the genesis for us to say, like, okay, well, this entry point binary can unlock all this other functionality. So once we've sort of stepped through that door, we just made that leap architecturally. It was from there that we were like, oh man, now we can use it for exec, now we can use it for config sourcing now. And so it kind of opened up, kind of mushroomed out after we kind of went through that door. So yeah.
Really interesting. I've really enjoyed that ability, and like you said, to be able to execute that one command, run the database migrations, or get a sense of what the logs are showing. I think even just like with the dynamic config, I found that really helpful in terms of just refreshing the application. I don't have to go and build that again. I can just rely on that configuration, which is really fantastic. Yep. When it comes to mostly, I think the biggest thing that I've been able to compare Waypoint to are other CI/CD platforms. And I know that Waypoint, I'm biased, obviously work at Hashicorp, but getting a sense of what CI/CD platforms are out there and kind of what they do, I feel like I've almost been let down in that Flux gives me the ability to define a manifest and declare a version that I want to release. Argo will kind of watch something and then also do the same thing. But I like that Waypoint fills the gap of actually taking care of a build. And I don't feel like I know that those tools are kind of, trending on figuring that out and have some things in alpha, but I really like that Waypoint has the ability to build, release and deploy and kind of stage things in that way. Are there any big considerations that y'all took on that front in terms of seeing what was out there and then figuring out, how to reboot that whole deploy process?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a lot of, when we started the project, when we were working on it, basically this time last year or so, we were probably into our third or fourth prototype. So Mitchell and I were basically writing separate prototypes and then coming back to, is this what we want? Is this how this should look and feel, right? Because we weren't exactly sure how we wanted to approach those things. And we had a lot of conversations around this idea of how far do you extend past the place where you're like, hey, platform, run this thing, right? How far do you extend past that point? And what do other things do? So you give a couple of examples, and even other ones that Hashicorp builds, to a certain extent, like Nomad has logs and stuff like that, but even Nomad, you give it off and it's like, okay, you're running into the thing and I don't really need to know. But we wanted to have this answer this question of, was it important to be able to not just hand it off and say like, okay, I'm done, wash my hands with that build, I can go off and do something else, but instead give the developer the ability to look in, or the ops person the ability to say, is it working okay, and what's going on with it, and do I need to do this other thing, right? And we made the decision that, we didn't want to just stop, have this clean break at the I've told you to run phase. And the reason is there's a gap there, as you sort of pointed out, but that gap is also really important because as developers know, when you're running a service, you deploy it and then you find out if it works, you write some more code, you fix this, and then you deploy it again, right? The deploy is never the last point. In fact, it's probably the very beginning of the middle of the beginning, if any point. And so this question of, well, if we're a build deployment tool, we need to help people know what to build and when to deploy. And the way that you do that is by extending the functionality into the runtime path enough to let people know, for instance, the Waypoint logs functionality. I do a deploy, I go, okay, it's out, I do logs, I look at it, I look at the logs, I see if an error popped up, or I go reload it in my web browser. It says, oh, an error happened. Oh, I type Waypoint logs, I look what happened on the output. Oh, shoot, I called that variable X and it was really supposed to be Y. I go back, and then that gives you a feedback loop to go back over to start doing the development again. I need to change X to Y, and then I type Waypoint up again, and I do the build, and then I release it. And so if you don't, we felt it was really important to give people a way of going from the after the deploy phase back to build that bridge back to the beginning, because that cycle is really how people write software. It's like, we didn't want people to feel like, oh, well, the deployment it's really hard to figure out what's happening in production. So I need to really take a lot of time. I need to do full waterfall of wait till the last possible moment to deploy. It's like, that's not really how people work now. So we wanted to be sure that there was that sort of return path to begin again.
I think that one helpful thing on that front too has been the the Horizon URL, and being able to like I just I've got a demo for the end of the session, but at the end of the day, I'm deploying to a Kubernetes cluster, and I've got a cluster IP, and so that's not unless I'm on that network or I've VPN'd in or have found a way onto that network, I'm not going to be able to see that. But having that Horizon URL to pass around and then show that here's V1, 2, 3. What's changed? Could we roll back? What does this look like? Has also been something that's been really helpful in getting that healthy feedback loop in terms of the development process.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, more things to just get you on that return path after the deploy to figure out, okay, it worked, I can move on to the next thing, or I need to fix the bug or whatever. Yep.
I'm just the +1 to say that I honestly love that feature. It was like my dream pipeline for literally years. I've written this on so many different whiteboards, was to kind of have the functionality to provide up a QA environment for our QA team every time, and have it provisioned down. So being able to do that URL with it is it's so nice. Like, that's all I had to say. I just wanted to +1 that I like it.
Yeah. Question from the comments: where was this 10 years ago? It was me. It's really nice to have, and when you've so we can deploy to Nomad, Kubernetes, and just a host of things. What does that look like what are some of the considerations when deploying to serverless technologies, whether that be on Azure or Google, Amazon? What are some of the concerns there? Because obviously that's got to be a lot different because of the short-lived timeframes and things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we're that's one of the big features of 0.3 is we're building in Lambda support. And so it's been interesting for us to kind of like pick through that, right? So one of the things, some of the functionality still works fine, right? So if you have the functionality related to like, hey, I want to connect back to the Waypoint server and I want to download my config. Well, that works even if the container is only running for 10 seconds. You can still take 500 milliseconds to connect back and get your config before you go do your work, right? So that whole portion still works fine. But the portion that doesn't really work very well is like specifically the exec functionality, and the fact that the logs functionality is going to be necessarily limited in a way that's not really helpful. Because right now, the logs functionality is related to like, hey, what's going on with the instances that are currently running? But if those instances are popping in and out really quickly because they're being spun up, if you're Cloud Run, if your container instances or wherever you are, and they're basically being spun up and spun down very rapidly, the actual logs for those things, Waypoint server right now, it will expunge the logs once it disconnects, because the idea initially was, hey, I want to give the logs for what's actually running right now. And so for 0.3, we've taken that to heart and said like, okay, well, what do we need to support in order for those platforms to feel right, to have that right sort of mouth feel, if you will, that they actually work correctly. And the two things were that we needed to expose, sort of like what we did way back in the prototypes, like I alluded to earlier, we needed to expose the ability to use those platform-specific logs and exec functionality. So to give you an example, if you're deploying to Lambda, well, you probably just want to read the logs from CloudWatch logs. They're already going there. So let's just read them directly out of there and not worry about what the view of the Waypoint server has, right? So we wanted to basically build through and say like, okay, I want to go off and build that. And secondarily, and this is kind of a feature that I'm really excited about for 0.3 to build it out for Lambda is, well, how do you implement exec if you're doing it on a Lambda? And so we basically went through a bunch of different ways of doing it. And what we ended up doing was we added into the core the ability for the plugins to say like, I just want to go off and exec something. And the way that we do that actually is we spin up a little one node ECS cluster that has your Lambda code and inject all your config into there. And then you're just running you have an exec, you have it's the same as your code with all of your stuff. It's just now you're running inside sort of this on-demand ECS container that as soon as you exit, it just deletes itself, it goes away. But you can run a long database migration maybe it takes an hour. You can never do that if you're just sort of shim exec into a Lambda, because those have 15-minute timelines. So yeah, it was tricky, and we're excited for the kinds of platforms that will now be available on Waypoint, because they can use those hooks to implement them in more distinct ways.
It's a really interesting thing to kind of think through all of those abstractions, and by the time you're using the tool, you're not really thinking about it, and it just kind of feels like magic. And so thank you for kind of diving into that, because personally, I always find that very interesting.
Yeah.
One thing that's been fun to see or interesting really to see, is that so Kubernetes is removing Docker shim support, and there's a lot of talk about what OCI looks like, that open container interface, and how different projects support that. So I think that getting to kind of see how Waypoint has moved from version to version, and then kind of really take into account, introspecting and looking at the containers that it's dealing with under, behind the scenes, is also quite fascinating.
Yeah.
I think that when it comes to other Hashicorp projects as well, we've already seen, the integration with Vault. Are there any thoughts on what that might look like, and Nomad as well? Are there any thoughts on what that will look like for console and for Terraform? Any ideas on that front, or thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I could see console being slotted in directly into the config, where you can just reconfig console as a config source. And I think that we just didn't do that because we wanted to kind of set the bar and then move on. We didn't want to spend all of our time there. So I suspect that will probably come not too long from now. It'll be interesting. I think that there's an argument to be made about the integration of Waypoint with Console Connect, so that you can say like, oh, okay, well, I've spun this up in this way, and I want you to, at the same time, the entry point, go back and use Console Connect, so that service, no matter where it may be, is now a part of the Console Connect mesh, as it were, to be able to basically get new traffic. I think that could be very cool. So that's some of the things that we're thinking on for console. For Terraform, I think that the direction that we've been going integration-wise there is this idea of auxiliary services. So if I have a Node.js application that needs a MySQL database, okay, well, where am I getting the MySQL database? Right now, Waypoint is sort of abstract. It just says, okay, well, figure that out, and then give me the connect string and the password and all that kind of stuff. You can set it as your Waypoint config variables. But we really want to have that be a more seamless process. So we're currently thinking about ways that you can integrate Terraform into that process, so that, say, your ops team can go off and run the Terraform, and that Waypoint can then just go and say, like, I'm just going to dip into the Terraform config and pull out these few little variables, and then I'm going to use those. So maybe it's in that way. Maybe it ends up being in a way where we're not, I guess the question that kind of we're wrestling with, and we haven't come up with an answer yet, is, should Waypoint invoke Terraform? That's this sort of fundamental question. Like, who's upstream of whom, right? Is that Terraform runs and then Waypoint reads its state? Is it that Waypoint decides it needs to do something that is more Terraformy, so it invokes Terraform in some way? We're not really sure yet, because it's sort of this question of like, what's least surprising for folks, what makes the best workflows. So it's a little bit open-ended, but the idea is effectively that Waypoint has the ability to say, okay, there's some things out there, it's databases, it's whatever Terraform supports, and then the ability to take and look inside that Terraform state and basically say, okay, I'm going to pull this out and I'm going to make those available as environment variables inside your app. So that way you've got that bridge from the ops phase to the runtime phase.
And I think that is going to be really helpful because like right now, it's very easy for me to spin up the Waypoint server with a Docker file or install into Kubernetes and kind of be on my way. But I agree. I think that's going to be really helpful to have teams be able to set up each of those components, and then as you onboard or teams shift to using Waypoint, they have that ability to just kind of interact. One thing I know that's kind of underway and in being developed out is what do the auth flows look like for Waypoint? I know like Waypoint UI -authenticate, you can kind of jump into the web page and work with that. You've got a token that way. When it comes to Horizon and sourcing out those URLs, is that something that might be on the roadmap in the future? Is being able to kind of configure that, or like, if you're a big enterprise, you want to keep that secret, kind of shifting or have a custom URL, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that. It's not on any roadmaps at the moment, mostly just because we've been working on, Lambda and all that other kind of stuff. So it's kind of figuring out where we should spend our time. But yeah, we've talked about that, that sort of thing. If it's just a simple password on that endpoint, or whatever it might be. So probably it will grow that eventually, but I'm not sure when right now. So
that's I fully feel like that's one of the biggest signs in realizing kind of where you are at in your engineering journey, is being able to go, like, you see all of the awesome things that are going to happen. You're like, let's focus on at least like one or two of these.
Yeah, it's a pretty small team still right now, and so it's really a question of it's not a question of great ideas. We got a lot of those. It's really a question of like, how do we want to execute them and not do them in a way that sort of betrays the quality and the right way of getting it done. So
awesome. One question I had for you was around Kubernetes deployments, and something that I really like that you did with the Waypoint project. You have your 3 different phases of deployments: your build phase, your release or your deploy phase, which kind of is that staging component, and then finally release, which is syncing up all the bits and the connections such that you see this version of what you've released. When it comes to best practices around managing all of the different deployments, so if I had say 10 deployments in Waypoint, and are any of those ever cleaned up, or are there settings that I can kind of set to manipulate that, so I don't have say like 100 deployments or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's a deployment goes through sort of the natural life cycle of it. It's created, and it really has 2 separate states. It's like the status of whether or not it's successful, running, and all that kind of stuff, and then another thing which is called its physical state, which is basically whether or not we think it is currently sort of out there in the world. And it defaults to created. It's like, hey, I made the thing. Waypoint explicitly does not try to go like dip into like, are you still where I said you were? It kind of says like, hey, I told you to be there. I haven't told you to not be there. I'm going to assume you're there. So that's created. And then right now we have a hard coded limit, although we've been just the last couple of days, we're discussing the ability to change it, we keep 2 of the, so if you deploy once, obviously you have 1 created deployment. If you deploy again, you have 2 created deployments. If you deploy a 3rd time, we actually destroy the oldest one, so that you still only have 2 created deployments. Now, if you were to go back in and say Waypoint deploy list, you'd see all 3 of them, but the first one would have a different, I have to remember the exact column name off the top of my head, but effectively it should, if it's not clear that it's not available for rollback, then we need to basically improve the UI around that. But it's right now, it's just that those last 2, like if I typed Waypoint rollback, I would really just be rolling back 1. I mean, you have to put in the ID, but I'd be rolling back a single time. We're talking about the ability to set like, oh, I want to be able to roll back 5 steps. Okay, great. So you could set that to 5, and then we keep around a group of 5 of those. But also the other way too, which is that like, oh, it's a resource issue. I only want to keep around. I don't need to roll back because I will only roll forward. So just, you only need to keep 1 or 0 extra. And so then it would destroy on every single one. The other aspect to that, so I guess does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the other aspect to it is this question of, so Waypoint has a very specific view of how it wants to manage those individual deployments. So if you're like on Kubernetes, if you were to go in, check it out, and you're looking at it, you'd see like, okay, great. So it created a separate Kubernetes deployment for that matches each actual Waypoint deployments, and they're basically one-to-one, and that's fine. And then when you release, we manipulate the Kubernetes service to point to the actual deployments. That's okay. It works fine for Waypoint. It has a very specific view of how Waypoint wants to do it, but it's not necessarily the way that people, if you weren't using Waypoint, would actually do stuff. They would use the rollout strategies that are available inside Kubernetes to basically manipulate that one single deployment to roll forward through a bunch of different things. And we've been discussing this last week actually about how we want to support that specific ability, where you want to say, like, actually, it's okay that you don't keep multiple Waypoint deployments, but I actually, at the same time, whenever you roll forward, I want you to reuse the same Kubernetes deployment in this case, and use the actual deployment hooks that are available on it to monitor it to actually roll it forward. So that is top of mind for us, because I think that we built it in a very specific way because we felt like, hey, this is the way that makes the most sense for us, for Waypoint to work initially. But we're very open to the fact of, like, wow, this is not, like, my ops team isn't comfortable with that. I have 10 deployment objects out there or whatever it might be. So we want to let Waypoint work for those different kinds of scenarios. So
cool. Awesome. No, thank you so much. I think that that's really, really important to know too, is, really being mindful of how you go about constructing your workflow. And, you can either go all in with Waypoint and follow that strategy, or, like you said, figure that in one piece out in Kubernetes and just really decide what your workflow looks like.
Yep.
Cool.
So we did have some questions come up in chat. I'm sorry, I keep looking back because my rats apparently decided this is the correct time to be awake and also making a ton of noise. Yeah. The first question that we had come in is, will Waypoint be more focused on dev environments, or could it also be thought of for prod pushes?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of explicitly didn't give it a lot of dev focus at present, because we felt like the gap that we wanted to really look at was that I've got my app going and I know that this is the right thing for me, and now I actually want to go out and deploy it. So, I mean, we haven't been talking a lot about how Waypoint bleeds sort of downward in the stack into your actual deployment phasing. You could use it for that. Right now, you could basically have a Waypoint server set up. You could have it point to, like, say, local Docker, and you could do a Waypoint up to deploy your app to local Docker to basically go off and use. That would work fine. Waypoint wouldn't necessarily know that it's production versus development or any of that kind of stuff. You just basically be using it in a more development-like sort of context. Yeah.
Awesome. And another question we had come in. I'll do a different one first. We had a lot of fun comments on your shirt. People like your shirt. Someone would like to know where they can get one as well.
I don't know. You know what? I'd like to say that I had to go search it out, but it actually just arrived on my doorstep one day. So I know that let me see if I can find it. So we have the merch store.hashicorp.com. I'm a company man. So I think my guess is that we don't have shirts up there right now. I'm literally clicking through it. We have socks, we have a hoodie, a mug, we have the black shirt, and then we have, strangely, a Timbuktu bag, but I mean, that's all good on the Timbuktu bag. But we only have the one shirt right now. So I suspect that if we were to go ask the powers that be, they would say, oh yeah, we have plans to support product specific shirts, and those would be coming at some future quarter.
For now, personally, I just do this. It might be whatever. It could be Waypoint. It's up to you.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah. I love, as we're talking in Zoom, the dots are really bad on MPEG compression, because they are very small, and what ends up happening is they get encoded as like a moire pattern, and so basically, if I move up and down in the actual Zoom thing, it goes whoa. So yeah, I love it for that reason. So
it's a bug or feature?
No,
as he proceeds to move more.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And then the other question we had come in was, is it going to be possible to set CLI variables to affect the waypoint.hcl? So for example, let's say I want to change the tag of the Docker image being deployed, maybe something like waypoint up dash app equals foobar. Oh, foo, there we go. Dash var release tag equals bar. That's a lot harder to read out loud than it is just to type. But
yeah. So I think we've talked about it. I suspect that it will probably show up sooner rather than later, based off the conversations that we've been having in development, because for this very reason, which is like, hey, I want to go do this thing and this, I want to have it work in a specific way. You can kind of work around it using the various HCL functions right now. So I'd have to go look. Did we? I can go look real fast. Trying to remember if we pulled through the ability to read an environment variable in the functions. I don't think we did. So the other thing you can do if you really want to, if you're like, I really need it right now, is you can use file. So if there's a file function that can just read a file. So in that way, you can basically say, hey, I need to plumb this variable in there so I can write the file. And then in my Waypoint HCL file, I can say file and then the path to it. And it will basically read the contents of that file out. And then you can sort of use it however you want. So that's sort of the wormhole around that limitation right now.
Awesome. If you have any more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And then otherwise, if we don't have any questions, I think we're going to move on to our live demo and then round things out if y'all have any more questions past that. All right. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt or anything like that. We'll be happy to oblige. Thank you so much, Evan, for going through everything with us today. And yeah, feel free to hang around if you have time and critique what I'm working on. Would really appreciate it. Otherwise, if you should bounce, totally fine. Awesome.
Bold of you to invite live critiques on a live demo, but carry on.
It's like, are you not entertained?
The demo, let's make it happen. The demo gods must be quenched.
I love working here. So what are we working with today? First off, let's make sure that y'all can read this. I'm going to be publishing out this code later this week. This is part of another presentation that I have coming up. And what this is really focused on is how you can use your Hashicorp stack knowledge and apply that within an Azure context. So I have done a little bit of cooking show magic trickery, which is just kind of, I'm going to show you the ingredients for cake and then pull a fully baked one out from underneath the countertop. So really quick, I'll kind of walk through what I have here. If you want me to pause and talk about any of these things, feel free. But what I've essentially done is I'll go here to Terraform using Terraform 0.14.7. I'm using Terraform Cloud as well to store my state as well as some of my secret variables. And then I've got some required providers here. It's always best to pin your providers. Otherwise, you can invite a world of hurt when you go to try to reproduce your environments or your infrastructure. So just a healthy bit of caution there on that front. So I'm pulling in these values and these variables. Next, I'm setting up a network within the Azure space and just kind of giving it this CIDR range. I'm only creating one subnet, and I'm making that depend on my Azure resource group. So Azure creates a resource group such that you can kind of button everything up and keep it all together. So here I'm giving it a name and a location. If I jumped into my Terraform variables, you would see the name is AKS Hashicorp. The region is West US, which is just close to me. I live in Los Angeles, so always nice to have less latency. If I really wanted to tempt fate and the demo gods, I would probably pick somewhere in Europe or Australia. I am standing up an AKS cluster, which I started on here. I'm creating 3 nodes, giving it some storage space. And then lastly, I'm standing up Vault and Console and some other things on this front. But today I'm just going to walk through Waypoint and illustrate how you can change values and variables with that dynamic config using a config map within Kubernetes. So we won't really get to console and vault today, but just keep in mind that this will be part of another presentation later on, and I'll be more than happy to share it with you in a little bit. So that is everything there. If we jump on over here, I'll pull in my shell. So like I said, we've already baked the cake. I've already run Terraform, plan, and apply to make sure all the code is all right. So let's go ahead and use Kubernetes. So for those of you that don't use Kubernetes much, I'm using some shorthand. So I've aliased kube control or cuddle or CTL to the letter K, just because I like to type less. That's always fun. And then I'm getting those nodes. Kubernetes has some shorthand in it, so I can use PO for pods, NO for nodes, so on and so forth. So if you see something that looks like a shortened version, I'm more than happy to kind of expand on what that stands for. So we can see we have our 3 nodes. If we go to get our pods within this namespace, we can see that with the console work that I'm doing, all of these console pods are up and running. So that's great, that's dandy, but we're talking Waypoint today, right? So let's move into that direction. So with Waypoint, I actually want to go about installing the Waypoint server. So actually, I forgot to delete a service here. All right. Yeah, always test your demos, but make sure that you have cleared out all of your demo stuff before you actually go to give said demo. Step 1.
No, you're just showing them how to clean the space up first. It's all good.
I like that.
Working as intended.
Absolutely. So I'll wait for that to clear. Sometimes I've noticed it does take a little bit, especially when you're using a managed service or cloud or something like that. So might just take a second here. In the meantime, so what I'm going to be doing is standing up the Waypoint server. Okay, fantastic. Standing up the Waypoint server such that I can actually track my deployments and get all of my Waypoint stuff running and good to go. So this is spinning up right now. If I were to jump in here to a different shell and take a look at the pods that are spinning up, I would see that my container is creating. So as soon as that is ready, I'm going to be good to go so that I can get off to the races and actually start doing some deployments. I'll blow this up just a little bit, resize that window. And good. At some point in time, Evan might want to get, I might open up a GitHub issue about plugin for theme music that we can play while
that's
installing.
a good idea.
Would be a lot of fun.
Yeah. It's not a lot of theme music that's dipped over into public domain, I don't think, because it'd have to be something from the 40s. But we could find something. We could find something good. So
it's like we could call it speakeasy. That sounds about the right time period for that kind of music.
Like
I think JFrog actually beat us to that one.
Darn it. Awesome. My Waypoint server is up and running. So now I can actually go Waypoint UI and authenticate and start to pull that up in my browser. Let me actually show you what that looks like. So because I haven't set all of the right variables and haven't exposed this with a proper FQDN or a cert, I'm going to get this message right. So I can proceed. It's unsafe. That's okay. We know that that's going to be the case today. And we can see that we have no projects. Let's go about changing that and fixing that up. So I'm going to shift here into my application folder. Let's take a look at what we have here. So you can see I've got my config map. I'm going to be using that to configure some values within my Waypoint deployment today. This is just a simple Node.js application, and it's going to echo out. It's just in Waypoint examples, you can actually source this, pull this, and see all of this code that I'm working with. If I were to take a look at my Waypoint file, you can see here that I've got my config. This is just example Node.js. I'm giving it some labels. I'm using Webpack to build this, so I'm not going to be using a Docker image directly. I'm going to allow Waypoint to figure that out on my behalf. I'm going to be storing this at my location on Docker Hub as example Node.js. I'm giving this a tag of 1, but there are some special functions that you can use, like the SHA commit, and kind of change that up so that's a little bit better. And then lastly, my deploy step, I just want the probe path to be that root level directory, and then releasing it, I'm going to be using Kubernetes. So I can go in here and type in Waypoint init, and my project is initialized. When I've done that Waypoint init, I should see, and there it is, my folder for the project that I have. I can click into that and click in further to that build, and we can see that there are no builds released yet. So I'm actually going to do a split screen here, because what's nice about Waypoint is that all of this happens in real time and you don't have to refresh that page to actually see what's going on. So I'm pretty confident that this is going to work. So I'm just going to go ahead and do Waypoint up. You can run each of the Waypoint steps on their own. So whether it be Waypoint build and deploy, and there are a bunch of commands within Waypoint, but know that you could just use Waypoint up to run through the entire process if you want to get this released and deployed. So right now, Waypoint has identified the project correctly as a node project, and you can see that this is building right now. I could actually take a look at the logs within the Waypoint server. Like Evan said, it's streaming logs. I'm able to keep track of what's going on there, make sure everything is working as I expect it to. And then now we're pushing that example to my Docker Hub, which fantastic. And now it's actually deploying on Kubernetes. So if I were to shift over here and take a look at, let me shrink this down just a little bit. One of these days, whoops. One of these days I'll learn how to manage my shell a little bit better. So let's take a look at the pods, and we can see this example here is now running, and I have fully deployed my application. Fantastic. Now here in the screen, you'll see in this latest release, if I were to click this, since I'm using cluster IPs right now, this page is not going to load, but we have that nifty feature we talked about with the Horizon URL. And if I click this, I can actually see a preview of this application. If I were to make changes, I could click back and forth between the different versions, and which is really helpful and really cool. So if I actually wanted to go about changing in this application, if I wanted to jump in here and say change the, if I were to change the logo or the color, I could go about doing that. If you pay attention to this line here, you'll see process env secret name. This is what I've defined within my Waypoint configuration as my secret name. I'm using Kubernetes with this Waypoint demo config map based on the username key. So what does that look like? Let me grab that config map, and you'll see here it is. So if I were to change this username to Taylor, and I were to go about deploying that, this will be app config map. You'll see that I used secret, hashed, of course, with the E's as 3s, because this was a secret username, and I just kind of wanted to see what this would look like and make sure everything would run all right. If I jump into the logs here for that deployment that I just released, you'll see environment variables changed, sending a new child command. It's actually terminating the child process for restart. So because I changed my username from secret to Taylor, it's actually going about handling a complete restart of that application on my behalf. And now it's back up and running. So if I were to go back to my application, I can refresh this and see that my name Taylor is in there, which can create for many really interesting workflows or update patterns, that are available to you. And thus concludes the live demo for today. Thank you all for bearing with me as in my forgetting of services and other things. But hope you enjoyed that, and happy to answer any questions if you have them.
I only had one quick thing, which is I hope everybody gets as much delight out of the randomly generated host names that we do internally. I can tell you that it uses the same code that the Terraform random pet uses. And I may or may not have built Horizon simply so that I could actually make URLs from that thing, because they are wonderful. Directly generous cat is it. I mean, you can see it in your mind. You can see a cat that is like actually giving fish away. Like, it's perfect. So
it's like directly generous. Hopefully declaratively generous.
Not haphazardly generous. Indirectly, you know.
One of my favorites. I wonder if we're going to ever have the I can't remember what it was, but was it Lazy Wozniak? I think in Docker that was one of the auto-generated names that they don't allow to happen. They've got that wonderful if statement. Yep. So I wonder if we'll ever find a combination of pets and modifiers.
We have found some that maybe we shouldn't make that one anymore. I'll leave them up to people to figure out what those might or may not have been. But
like fastest tortoise.
So.
Yeah.
I know what I'm doing right after we get offline.
I think that's one thing that's sad is that in that focus of wanting to deliver applications and quickly iterate and get things out, there's this lack of Easter eggs inside of projects. So sure. I'm very happy to anytime that we can find those out. That's always fun to discover.
Absolutely.
Awesome. And it looks like, it's boring Wozniak. Okay, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely agree with that one.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, looks like we have no more questions. So I guess we can go about wrapping things up. Thank you all for stopping by today and exploring Waypoint with us. If you have any questions and would like to get them asked to the team, please check out discuss.hashicorp.com. It's a wonderful place to ask different Waypoint questions, interact with practitioners, and really just get a sense of, if you are having an issue, source that out and see if that's a good place to then open up a GitHub issue. It's just a really good place to discuss things is within our forum. Also, make sure to check out learn.hashicorp.com. And there are, for all of our products, we have wonderful learning tracks to be able to check things out, Waypoint included, and just overall one of the most fun places on the internet to go about learning some new things. So can't recommend that too highly. With that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Evan and Jackie. Do you have any fun parting words or euphemisms or quotes that you've heard lately?
I've already used the demo gods must be quenched today. I think I've topped out. I think I gotta go have lunch now. So
yes, I have tweeted that out. Otherwise, the only thing I had to share is that I also just found out we have a Waypoint examples repository.
Yes.
Dropping that in chat. So if you're looking for some examples of how to do things with Waypoint, perfect place to look.
Yep.
Let's see. I think we just got added. What are we getting added? Oh, yes. And there are more deep dives coming up this week with a link coming very shortly. Very shortly.
Awesome. Well, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, afternoon, whatever time zone you might be in. And we'll catch you on our next community office hours. Till then, have fun.
And the link is in the chat. Thank you so much for joining, everyone.